This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. Beginning in the 1640s, Puebloans from the Rio Grande area, especially Taos, but in the 1640s, Puebloans began fleeing the rule of the Spanish in New Mexico and heading to the Great Plains to settle down with a people the Spanish would call the Cortalejo Apaches. These Puebloans were sick of the religious and the Spanish and their harsh encomienda system, so a few of them abandoned their homes and pueblos and went to the canyons of eastern Colorado and western Kansas, a place that used to be, long ago, underwater and is today littered with the fossils of ancient sea monsters and the eroded banks of that ancient ocean. One such place is called Monument Rocks. When the Puebloans arrived to one of these canyons, Ladder Creek Canyon in particular, not far from those Monument Rocks, they were met by these Cortalejo Apaches, who already had huts and wickiups set up. It seems the Apaches welcomed the Puebloans, who felt the canyon was more akin to their homes down in New Mexico, as opposed to the open plains around them. The canyon had good soil for farming. It protected the people from the constant wind and harsh elements. It wasn't nearly as flat and dry as the surrounding high plains. It was overall a good place to settle down for these fleeing Taos Puebloans. In 1664, after a small uprising at Taos, a whole bunch more Taos Puebloans abandoned their homes in New Mexico, and they fled for the El Cortalejo site that they must have been in contact with. Otherwise, how would they have known to go there? The Plains Apache, again, after this group arrived, they welcomed the Puebloans. But the Spanish, after learning of the refugees, sent a Lieutenant Juan de Archuleta to go up and retrieve these Puebloans and bring them back to their rightful homes. Despite this forced removal from the canyons, these canyons that were hid among the plains of Kansas and Colorado, Taos Puebloans were already back at El Cortalejo to live with the Apaches by the 1660s. Again, the Apaches and the Puebloans lived in harmony as they hunted the bountiful wildlife, drank from the plentiful streams, and enjoyed the fertile soil and the roaming buffalo. Then, after the Pueblo Revolt and subsequent reconquest by Don Diego de Vargas in 1696, another group of Puebloans, about 60 of the Picures, also joined the Cortalejo Puebloans and Apaches. They were followed shortly by some Tewa Puebloans from Santa Clara. By this time, it seemed the Puebloans and the Apaches, they were no longer getting along. There were a few reasons for this, but the main one began with a Ka and ended with a Manchi. In 1706, the Spanish in New Mexico received word from the far-flung Cortalejo Pueblos that the Apache had begun to mistreat them, and if the Spanish could please send us an escort to bring us back home safely, that would be great. But it wasn't just the Apache that were beginning to pick fights with the Puebloans. The Comanche had recently arrived on the scene, and they too were starting trouble. With everyone, really. The Spanish governor at that time, Francisco Cuervo y Valdez, took the message seriously, and as soon as his general, Juan de Ulibarri, had returned from scouting the upcoming city of Albuquerque, which is in the great forest of Doña Luisa on the banks of the Rio Grande, as soon as Ulibarri had returned to Santa Fe, the governor sent the man northeast to bring back these Puebloans. Ulibarri is a man I've talked about before. He is a storied soldier and Indian fighter who fought in the reconquest of New Mexico, fought against the Navajo at El Morro, and even most likely had an adopted Apache son. So, on July the 13th, 1706, Ulibarri led 28 soldiers, 12 militiamen, and 100 Puebloan auxiliaries into the Buffalo Plains of the North. The leader of the auxiliaries was a man I have spoken of before. He was probably a man Ulibarri was related to through marriage. He was also probably a son of one of the leaders of the Pueblo Revolt. He was also, I believe, of African descent because he was very dark. He was a man who switched sides from his father and the Puebloans to the Spanish, He was of Hopi descent, and his name was Jose Naranjo. Also with Ulibarri was a Frenchman named Jean L'Archevêque, and he was a survivor of the La Salle expedition, a survivor and one of the men who actually killed La Salle. He had fled from the French and had sworn allegiance to Spain after that little murder on the high plains. Probably not the most trustworthy man, but a man who will come up again later in the episode, for he was rather handy out on the open plains. You know, it's so great to hear about all these people that I've talked about before in a totally different context than the last time I spoke of them. So listeners who have heard all the episodes, including the Roadrunner exclusives, will know about the La Salle expedition, the Cortalejo Apaches, the mysterious Naranjos, L'Archevêque, and even Ulibarri. History is such a delightfully tangled web, especially the history of the American Southwest. Well, this group, they headed north, and Ulibarri thankfully kept a journal of the expedition. That's how we know so much of what happens. First, the group went to Taos, where they stayed to give backup to the Puebloans on account of an impending Ute attack. But when that Ute attack never materialized, the expedition crossed the Sangre de Cristos and headed north. After reaching the Cimarron and Canadian rivers, Ulibarri mentions that they ran into a semi-agricultural band of Jicarilla Apaches. These Jicarilla Apaches welcomed the Spanish, and the two exchanged gifts, and Ulibarri and his expedition stayed a few days. But then they were on their way again. First, they crossed into modern-day Colorado, and then they came upon the Great Plains. Naranjo, who was acting as a guide at this time, and who I believe could speak Apache on account of an Apache woman he had been with previously, Naranjo warned Ulibarri that the way ahead was tough, and it's likely that they will get lost, which they then proceeded to do. Even though, I thought this was interesting, they were following piles of grass that the Apaches set up and used as guides for themselves out on these high plains. Kind of like rock cairns on slick rock, but instead they're piles of grass cairns on the Buffalo Plains. Eventually, though, by August 3rd, the expedition had made it to El Cortalejo. It may seem like El Cortalejo is just one site, like the one in Kansas that I went to recently, but in reality, it was the name given to the whole region of canyons on the plains that the Puebloans had been fleeing to since possibly the 1620s, but definitely the 1640s. And again, these Apaches were named El Cortalejo Apaches. On the hillside, welcoming the Spanish, was a large cross the Apaches had built as a sign of peace. It turns out, things really had soured on the Great Plains, and the Apache had taken some Puebloans hostage. Most of this sourness actually came from pressure from 3 groups that were entering the area and causing trouble. One group I've already mentioned, the Comanches. The other 2 were the Pawnee and the Utes. And all of these were pretty much backed by the French. At Cortalejo, though, Ulibarri paid the ransom for 5 Puebloans to the Apaches, and then he sent 2 runners, one of them traveling 100 miles away, he sent these 2 runners to 2 other Cortalejo settlements. And he did that to give them word that if they desired, the Spanish would bring them back to New Mexico. Of course, Ulibarri took the time to claim the entire area for Spain. Why not? But all the while, Ulibarri and his men were leery of attacks from the Ute or Comanche with their superior French powder and arms. Especially after the Apache showed Ulibarri a French rifle they say they took from a Frenchman after killing he and his unfortunate wife. Eventually, Ulibarri had around 60 Puebloans, or as Ulibarri put it, quote, 62 persons, small and grown, of the Picurus, who were living as apostates, slaves of the devil, end quote. So the entire expedition, plus these 62, went back to New Mexico pretty much the same route that they traveled on to get there, and they were back at their various pueblos and in Santa Fe by September 2nd. But before they got back to Santa Fe, Ulibarri visited with those same Jicarilla Apaches that they'd stayed with earlier. These Apaches had been watching some of the expedition's horses while they were out on the plains. And apparently, during that time, these Apaches had been raided not once, but twice by the Comanche and the Utes. The Utes and the Comanche are both Shoshone, which essentially makes them cousins. Besides being successful in quote-unquote rescuing over 60 Puebloans, Ulibarri's expedition was also successful in building better relations between the Spanish and the Plains Apache. Although that better relations is mainly due to other outside forces being more formidable. For most of the 1700s, though, better relations with the Western Apache would not be the reality. And by 1724, according to Frank C. Lockwood in his The Apache Indians, but by 1724, quote, the Apaches had become so aggressive that it looked as if white civilization in northern Mexico would be wiped out. End quote. This episode won't only focus on the fight for survival between the Apaches and the Spanish in the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest. I will also go into what was happening to the Eastern and the Plains Apaches as well. There's a lot of history in the 18th century with the Apaches and the Comanche and early Spanish Texas and the French and others. And during this whole century, the Apaches' way of life will constantly evolve as their territory changes and their fearsome reputation grows. Those Cuartalejo Apache were part of something archaeologists call the Dismal River culture. And this culture consisted of two separate Apache groups, with one obviously being the Cuartalejo and the other being the Paloma, who became the Kiowa Apache or Plains Apache. The Plains Apache, though, they would later migrate to Oklahoma and Texas after being pressured to do so by the Pawnee French and their major enemy, the Comanche. The Cuartalejo Apache would also move south, where they probably joined the Lipan and Jicarilla Apache, and they did that for the same reasons as the Plains Apache had. Lipan means the light gray people in the Apache language. There's Lipai, which means light gray, and Nd, which, as we know from the last episode, means the people, Lipand. There's a lot of revolving terms used for the Apaches throughout this episode and this whole series, really. And that's mostly because these bands weren't fixed, but they were always changing and evolving as they migrated and mixed and merged and split apart. I try to use only a few terms, but each source calls the same people something different, so it can get a little complicated, and for that I apologize. The Dismal River culture of the Apaches lived in Navajo-Hogan-like huts with hides over them, and they congregated around streams of the western Great Plains, mostly Nebraska actually, before going down to Kansas. They used stone arrowheads, bone tools, they hunted bison, and they fired some gray pottery bowls. The era of the Dismal River culture was mostly during this time that the Puebloans were there in the mid-1600s. Before that, the Apache were purely nomadic, and there is not much if any artifacts to suggest they were even in this area of the western Great Plains. Although it is believed that they arrived to this area around the 1500s possibly, which is considerably later than the western Apache's possible arrival into Arizona, but I still don't know. There's so much unknown about the early Athabascans. But there is one interesting theory that I must dispute. I am not a historical myth buster like other history podcasters, but this one was shown, myth was shown to me, and I feel like I've got to talk about it. A Navajo historian named Wally Brown, in a video, claimed that it wasn't the Puebloans who built the ruins at El Cuartalejo in Kansas, but it was the Athabascans, the Navajo specifically. He claimed that the Diné had emerged from this spot or had come down from Canada 2,000 years ago. And actually, the Athabascans were the ones that taught the Puebloans how to build the masonry structures, not the other way around, according to Wally Brown. He says, quote, "Other people are given credit, but these are the structures that were made by the Towering House people," end quote. He claims the Towering House people were his 2,000-year-old Athabascan ancestors. He says that the Diné stopped building their homes with stones in the Pueblo style because earthquakes made them collapse, so they switched to hogans. Wally Brown goes on to say that the Cuartalejo ruins site in Kansas was the place of emergence for the Navajo, not the American Southwest. They lived at this spot apparently for 50 years, and then they moved west of the Rio Grande and south of the Book Cliffs of Utah, which is just north of Moab. So pretty much they moved to the Colorado Plateau or modern-day Diné. Wally Brown then goes on to say that after an argument over ceremonies, the Diné separated and many went far north to Canada and others went south and became Apache. But most stayed in Diné and became the Navajo. This view of the Navajo being in the area for much longer than evidence suggests is kind of taking off with both Diné and Anglos. I kind of see it all the time now. I don't personally buy it, though. Both DNA and language show that the Inde and Diné, Apache and Navajo, are closely related to their northern Athabascan neighbors in Canada and Alaska, who themselves are closely related to people in western Siberia and Eurasia. The Athabascans were likely one of, or the last major group to cross over into the New World. That being said, what Wally Brown and the Warrior producers are doing on their site and their YouTube channel is pretty great. They have tons of videos that preserve and share the Navajo and Diné culture, their beliefs, worldviews, and even just videos on the landscape of the American Southwest, or what they would call Diné, the Navajo land. I encourage people to check out his videos if they're interested in the Navajo or Diné. I probably will not ever cover the Navajo. There's just too much. But this increasingly popular opinion that the Navajo have always been here, they kicked out the Anasazi, they taught the ancient ones to build and farm, I don't believe that's correct. But then again, what do I know? I'm just guessing. Over 3 or 4 decades around the late early 1700s, the Comanche began their southward push on the Great Plains, which, as I previously stated, would force the Apache southward and out of their way. Now, part of that push was on account of the Sioux, who were themselves pushing the Comanche southward, and the Sioux were newcomers to the area of the North Great Plains. They had just came from the Great Lakes region, after they themselves had been pushed out of their homes in the east. And really, all of these stories of migration and pushing people out, it mirrors the steppes of Eurasia in a lot of ways. This story sounds like the constant surge of Eurasians into Western Europe. It mirrors, I guess, all of human history, really. John Upton Terrell states in his Apache Chronicle, The Story of the People, he states that in the beginning of the 1700s, quote, "The Apache of the high plains were faced with a new and swiftly growing danger. It was the southward migration of the Comanche." End quote. The Comanche were from the Upper Rockies, and they'd gained the horse and were given the name Comanche by the Spanish, who were always misunderstanding what the Indians were saying, but they misunderstood the Ute word Comancia, which means anyone who wants to fight me all the time. And I'm reminded of that casino scene in Hell or High Water. The Shoshone branch of Native Americans that became the Comanche, they were expert horsemen and warriors. They were just too much for the Apache to withstand. So the Apache eventually went south into New Mexico and Arizona. But that migration took some time. During the 1700s, the Spanish were far more worried about, and bothered by, the Comanche and the Navajo to focus on fighting the Eastern Plains Apaches. The Comanche and Utes to the north, they constantly wreaked havoc, while the Navajo to the west of New Mexico never ceased their warring against the colonies. To help alleviate the pain of these constant attacks, the Spanish actually made some alliances with the Jicarilla and Plains or Cortalejo Apaches. One band of Plains Apaches did not make alliances with the Spanish, though. That very important band of Apaches in this region, that was between the Rio Grande and the Pecos River and the region around Santa Fe, this important band of Apaches is known to us as the Pharaon, which is Pharaoh in Spanish, but they are the Pharaon Apaches. Later, they'd become the Mescalero Apaches, and the last time they're ever called the Pharaon is in 1814. But for now, this band of Pharaoh Apaches, lords of the plain, they're giving the Spanish a solid colonial headache. During the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Pharaon allied themselves with the Pueblos to kick out the Spanish. They lived to the east of the Sandia Mountains, which is a place I know well because I live currently in them. And they constantly sent small raids down into Santa Fe and Albuquerque and the surrounding towns, including my own little town. Once the Taos and Picuris Pueblo welcomed the Spanish back in and sided with them, the Pharaon Apaches considered these Puebloan Indians race traitors and instead focused many of their raids on these red men's Pueblos as well as the white man's. By 1715, the governor at that time, Juan Ignacio Flores Mogollon, had had enough of these Pharaon Apaches stealing horses and mules from the Pueblos that he was supposed to protect. So in August of that year, Mogollon sent Captain Juan Paez Hurtado, as well as 39 soldiers, 20 civilian settlers, and 151 Indian fighters. These fighters included men from Pecos, San Juan, Nambe, San Ildefonso, Santa Clara, Tesuque, Taos, Picuris, and a whole bunch of others. Apparently, 76 of these Puebloan warriors had guns. The punitive expedition also had plenty of horses and mules, and they expected to come back with even more stolen horses and mules. Hurtado and his men then crossed over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, east of Santa Fe, and they came down onto the plains at the gorgeous Mora River. There, he was then joined by 30 Jicarilla Apaches. So the Apaches had now begun to fight with each other. Or maybe not. It seems that although the punitive expedition found many Pharaon camps, they were all abandoned. Hurtado believed, probably correctly, that the Apache foe Pharaon had been warned by either Puebloans or the Jicarilla and Cortalejo Apache that had joined them. The expedition was an utter and complete failure. The only violence occurred when Hurtado had his guide whipped 50 times for being an alleged spy. A few years after the failed Hurtado expedition, the new and completely corrupt governor of New Mexico, Governor Valverde, he cheated and stole lands and cattle from both Puebloans and Apaches, and that sent them into the mountains, where they would begin raiding yet again. Raiding just to stay alive, really. Valverde's soldiers weren't treated any better, though, and he stole their wages and forced them to work his own stolen fields and animals. The guy was a regular crooked politician. Like any modern-day American politician, really. Well, the religious of the area, they got excited when in 1717, the Jicarilla Apache, they made some requests from the Spanish for help against the increasingly formidable and violent Comanches. The Spanish had been noticing for a few decades by now, by the early 1700s, that their old enemy, the Apache, their numbers had been dwindling. Their raids had slowed. Eventually, they would learn through messages like this one from the Jicarilla that the answer of the disappearing Apache was this new enemy, the Comanche. I know I'll take flack for quoting S.C. Gwynn's Empire of the Summer Moon, but he makes a good point about this battle between the two nations when he wrote, quote, "While this was most likely not an attempt to kill off the entire tribe, neither was it a simple question of moving the Apaches off their hunting grounds. The Comanches had a deep and abiding hatred of Apaches, and what they did to them also had a good deal to do with blood vengeance. Either way, the Comanches were in the middle of a relentless southward migration, and the Apaches were in the way." End quote. Obviously, the priests saw an opportunity to preach and possibly convert amongst these beleaguered Apaches, a people who had famously stayed far away from Catholicism thus far. So the priests asked Mexico City if they could gather a force to punish the Comanche, also preach amongst the Apache, and to finally, once and for freaking all, find out where the dastardly French were, and to stop them from arming the crown's enemies. About the French, it's important to note that on the continent, the European continent, the French and the Spanish were at war in what's known as the War of the Quadruple Alliance. Technically, Spain was at war with France, England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic, hence why it's called the Quadruple Alliance. This war had to do with Italy and Sicily, and it's only important to note because it fostered an atmosphere of fear in the hearts of the Spanish in the New World on the American continents. The Spanish figured now was as good a time as any for these four major European powers to take from them her possessions in the New World. But that particular war was over by 1720. But in September of 1717, the corrupt ex-soldier governor Valverde, he somehow amassed the largest army the Great Plains had seen since Oñate. He had 60 regular soldiers, 45 settlers, and 465 Puebloan allies. Eventually, this enormous army would also be joined by 196 Jicarilla Apaches. There were also almost 1,000 horses and mules among the leather jacket-wearing soldiers and settlers, along with, of course, plenty of tobacco, chocolate, sheep, and several casks of wine, mostly for the governor's consumption. Along the slow and leisurely taken route through the Great Plains, the governor and his army saw plenty of burned and destroyed Apache villages and settlements. And all the while, the Apache warriors who had accompanied the Spanish were regaling the governor with tales of their own sad history at the hands of the Comanche and the Ute. I bet they were saying, just look around. This was us. John Upton Terrell actually writes of this destruction. Quote, "In one rancheria alone, more than 60 Apache had been killed by raiders, who also carried away many women and children. The fighting and killing was occurring with greater frequency each year, and they would not be able to bear it much longer unless the Spanish helped them to defend themselves." End quote. Things were certainly looking rough for the Apache at the plains of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado, and Nebraska, which was a place they soon would no longer be able to call their own. During this Valverde trek, many Apaches would dance for the governor and sing his praises at night. Valverde seemed to also listen generously and intently to these Apaches' plights. And of course, Valverde, he promised them revenge and help, and that these Apaches would have their wrongs righted, and their land would be returned to them. And also, of course, the Comanche would be punished. Soon. Soon, my children. Just you wait. But as John Upton Tyrrell put it, Valverde, quote, took no action to demonstrate the sincerity of his words. Indeed, he did nothing at all for them. End quote. The Valverde excursion would come upon quite a few Comanche camps, but they'd also be abandoned, these Comanche camps, would just totally be abandoned. Sometimes they'd be abandoned recently, other times they'd been abandoned for quite some time. One such camp was estimated to have had over 1,000 warriors in it. But the Spanish had been too late, and the Comanche just could not be snuck up on. Valverde, of course, was not the first military leader to lose track of, become confused by, and become downright outmaneuvered by the Comanche. Nor would he be the last. Subscribers know that in 1856, Robert E. Lee himself was outmaneuvered by the Comanche when he was ordered to track them down and bring them back to the reservation. Eventually, with winter coming, Valverde had to give up on punishing the Comanche on behalf of the Apache, at least during this expedition. No, Valverde now had to focus on the French. John Upton Tyrrell tells a story from this time on the plains, Valverde's time on the plains. He tells a story about an Apache man who had great knowledge of the French and their whereabouts. It reads, quote, informed that an Apache had arrived who had suffered a gunshot wound that was not yet fully healed, he had him brought to his tent. There, said a report, now quoting the report, the governor examined the wound and asked him who had given it to him. And the report's quote, through interpreters, the wounded Apache, a Paloma, quote, answered that while he and his people were in their land, the French, united with the Pawnees and the Humanos, attacked them from ambush while they were planting corn. Placed on the defensive, they fought, and it was then that they gave him the oblique wound in the abdomen, which was still healing. Then there's a note from the author, John Upton Tyrrell, that says it must have been infected, as corn was planted in May or June, and this was mid-October. Now it's back to the reports. Quote, the Apache also said that had not night settled on them so that they could escape from their rancheria, none would have been alive. The Comanche seized the Paloma lands and held them from that time on. End all quotes. So, the Comanche and the Pawnee were on the warpath. But who are these Humano? I talked about the Humano in my subscriber-only episode over the Llano Estacado. I should have talked about them in the last episode, the first one over the Apache, probably. But the Humano were a Texan and New Mexican group of Native Americans that were probably three different peoples. The Texas State Historical Association suggests on their website that, quote, they include the Tompiro-speaking Pueblo Indians in Salinas, a nomadic trading group based around the Rio Grande and Rio Conchos, and the Caddoan-speaking Wichitas on the Arkansas River and Red River basins. End quote. Earlier historians, wrongly, I believe, they assumed the Humanos were Apaches. John Upton Tyrrell even calls them outlaw Apaches in his book, but I believe they were Puebloans. Puebloans who were branching out onto the Buffalo Plains, building small pueblos at the base of the Llano Estacado, and trading with the Mississippians and Eastern tribes and even the Plains tribes. At least maybe one branch of the Humanos were It's most likely the Spanish called a bunch of different groups the Humanos. The various Humano groups still had some characteristics that linked them together, though. One of those characteristics was their use of scarification and then filling those scars with paint. And they would use those to make stripes go down their face and bodies. So they'd scar themselves and then put certain materials in their skin when it was healing to create a pattern exactly like a tattoo. Also, according to various Spanish texts, the Humanos were a breastises out kind of group. The Spanish often remarked how they had their genitals and breasts just uncovered out in the wild, out in the sun. It's healthy. The men, and this is important, the men of the Humanos also cut their hair short except for one lock, which they would paint and stick feathers into, one lock of hair. That is very un-Apache. The Apache, you see, they loved to grow their hair long. In Eve Ball's Inde, an Apache Odyssey, Eve Ball interviews an Apache named Dakluji who tells many a story, really, but he talks about specifically the Apache way of life and battles and Apache warriors. And I am actually reading that entire awesome book for subscribers, chapter by chapter, if you're interested, and if you want to be a Roadrunner, to hear that. Well, Dakluji tells Eve Ball that, quote, "We glorified in our long, luxuriant hair, but other tribes cut at least part of theirs off. Long hair all over one's head was an expression of courage and a dare to one's enemies." He goes on to say, quote, "When I went to Carlisle, my hair came down to my knees. I braided it and fastened it under my belt to prevent its catching on brush and thorns." End quote. Of course, not all Apache bands are the same, but the Apache did indeed love to grow their hair out. So these Humano men having short hair tells me they probably were not Apaches. That tattooing, though, that sounds very Mogollonish or even Southern Puebloan. If you ever see pictographs or petroglyphs of them, the Mogollon, they are often depicted with stripes on their body and face. They even have depictions of themselves like this on ceramics. I went to a talk in my town of Tijeras, New Mexico, given by a grad student who was studying just this exact phenomenon of body modification, scarification, tattoos, or paint that was reflected in petroglyph, pictographs, and ceramics. I took some notes at that. She actually said that we're not sure if they painted or tattooed themselves, but if they did tattoo themselves, a 2,000-year-old cacti needle has been found in Utah that was wrapped with pigment on it, which suggests tattooing. There also have been found snake fangs and yucca needles, as well as turkey bones. All of these things were used in tattooing, they believe. And some of these tattoos were incomplete triangles under the eyes. There were swirls. They made crowns, or what we would call crowns, just like almost like a cartoon mountain with a line underneath it, a bunch of like a mountain chain. They had lines from eyes to the chin, circles on the face, crisscrosses on the face, inverted triangles. They had lines from mouth to chin, and they had lines from the mouth to those crowns that they would draw. That researcher's name was Keely Yanito, and it was a pretty interesting talk. I was going to use it in my revisiting of the Anasazi, but it fits here as well. The Humanos were often interpreters for the Spanish in the early days, but eventually they just kind of disappeared. Most likely, they went back west, or they merged with later Apache Plains Indians, or other tribes in the Texas and northern Mexican region. The story by the wounded Apache continues, though. I'll quote from it now. "The French have built 2 large pueblos, each of which is as large as that of Taos, In them they live together with the said Pawnees and Humanos Indians, to whom they have given long guns which they taught them to shoot. They also carry some small guns suspended from their belts. At the time of the fight, the Paloma had shouted at the French that they would ask the Spanish for help, and, quote, to this, the French responded that they would be greatly pleased to have them notify the Spanish and bring them there, for the Spanish were women. End all quotes. That's some good smack talk. Valverde wasn't as bothered by the insults as he was bothered by even more news that was told to him by this Apache man. The wounded Apache, he also told Valverde that some of their Apache women had been kidnapped by the French, but they had escaped. But during captivity, these women witnessed many more large French towns and forts that dotted the riverbanks of the Great Plains. There were at least 3 other settlements besides the 2 large forts previously mentioned. Obviously, this greatly worried the Spanish, but it also meant certain doom for the various Plains Apache. If these French were trading in both long guns and pistols with the Pawnee and Comanche, the Apache stood no chance. And it wasn't like the Spanish were any help either. The viceroy in Mexico City, after Valverde's return, told him to build a presidio, or fort, in the northern plains near the modern-day site of Cortalejo in Kansas. But Valverde correctly guessed that position was way too far away, and way too far away from Santa Fe, and there was no way they could safely support that. Instead, a presidio was built 70 miles from Santa Fe among the Jicarilla Apache. Well, there's at least some help that was coming for the Apache. Earlier, I mentioned that Juan de Larchevêque would be mentioned again. Well, it is that time. In 1720, Valverde sent another expedition into the Great Plains to see what was going on with the Comanche and the French. For some strange reason, Valverde sent a young, inexperienced, and ignorant of the territory, a young man, a Spanish soldier named Captain Pedro de Villasur. No one is sure why he picked him for the task. And on top of picking such an inexperienced captain, Valverde gave him very few men and very little equipment. Another one of the men that came along on the expedition is the same Naranjo that I mentioned earlier. Naranjo and Larchevêque were the guides for this mission and the last one. So at least the 2 had been to Cortalejo, although that would not be much help in the end. By August, this expedition had reached El Cortalejo, but they did not encounter a single hostile European or Indian the entire way thus far. And the Apache at Cortalejo, they weren't much help with information, as they knew nothing of their enemy's whereabouts, or at least that's what they told Villasur. So he headed further northeast. He made it all the way to the North Platte River, which is quite far from Santa Fe, really. He made it all the way to the confluence of the North and South Platte Rivers, which is near modern-day Columbus, Nebraska. At this point, Villasur learns that Pawnee Indians, are approaching his expedition. So he sends out an emissary to ask if they'd like to have a smoke. Apparently, though, the Pawnee weren't interested in such things because they kidnapped and held the messenger. Now, Villasur, he was stung by this kidnapping, so he made a defensive camp between the 2 rivers. And this is what John Upton Terrell wrote about what happened next on the morning of August 14th, 1720. And I quote, at dawn, several hundred Pawnee warriors attacked with such suddenness and fury that Villasur and a number of his men were slain before they could fire their guns. The Pueblo Indians panicked and escaped with the horse herd, but not before 11 of them had died. The professional Spanish soldiers fought with great bravery. They took a heavy toll of the Pawnee, but only 12 of them, almost all badly wounded, would break out of the ambush and live. Among the 30 soldiers and 11 Pueblos dead on the field were Naranjo, Father Minguez, Larchevêque, and the other civilians. Many of the Pawnee had been armed with guns, and not a few of them had been wearing French clothes. End quote. Obviously, the Spanish and their prestige among the other nations in the Americas, the other European nations, took a huge blow. Their standing on the world stage even suffered from this small yet definitive skirmish. Much like how the forced abandonment of the Salinas Pueblos by the Apache had helped the cause of the Pueblo Revolt, this attack helped bolster the Comanche and Ute, who proceeded to attack the Spanish and Apache with even greater fury all along the frontier. And by now, the Cortalejo and Jicarilla Apache had pretty much given up on getting any help from the beleaguered Spanish, although they would continue to ask for their help for the remainder of the century. The Spanish were in quite a bind. They were in a pickle. The early 1700s in their colony of New Mexico was a tough time. As John Upton Terrell states, quote, "The Ute would hold the north along the sources of the Rio Grande, and the Comanche would take complete control of western Kansas, southeastern Colorado, and the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas. The Navajo would dominate the vast region west of the Jemez and south of the San Juan, their raiders sweeping out of it great distances the year round to pillage and kill and take captives and drive off livestock." End quote. The Apache, they too were in a tough spot. Not only were the Utes and Comanches attacking them throughout the West, but in Spanish Texas. And in 1724, the Lipan Apaches fought a bloody and devastating battle against the Comanches, which saw the Lipan Apaches completely driven from southern Oklahoma and northern Texas. This battle was at a place known as the Great Mountain of Iron. It was on the Wichita River in Oklahoma, a place that is, I believe, either in the Wichita Mountains or maybe is Quartz Mountain to its west. But in Oklahoma, this battle lasted 9 days. By the end of that decade of the 1720s, the Apaches on the plains were so distraught over the Comanche attacks that they began seeking shelter at Pecos Pueblo. The same pueblo the Ferreon Apaches called traitors for siding with the Spanish. Well, now, the Apache were seeking shelter among these same Puebloans. In response to the Apache hiding among the Pecos Puebloans, the Comanche attacked the Pueblo. The Comanches would actually attack the Pueblo right up until 1838, when the whole thing was abandoned. To think, the Apache used to be the ones attacking the Puebloans. Now the Apache were among the Puebloans being attacked by the Comanche, asking for the Spanish help. And by now the Spanish realized that they needed to keep these Apache alive just to guard themselves against the Comanche. To help build a buffer zone, the Spanish actually gave the Apache some lands near Taos Pueblo. In 1733, a mission was even founded by the Spanish for the Apache. I believe it's the first mission built for the Apache, but I did read about multiple first missions among the Apache in various places from Janos to Texas to New Mexico, so I'm not sure, but the mission was built on the Rio Trompas. I don't believe it's the Las Trompas Church, that is known as the quote-unquote most perfectly preserved Spanish colonial church in the United States. Anyways, the mission in the lands did not really work, and the Comanche, by 1748, they had kicked the Jicarilla Apaches from their lands in West Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. The Jicarilla would not even stay near Taos and the lands that were given to them. By the mid-18th century, they were on the other side of the Front Range and the Jemez Mountains. They were near their current reservation in New Mexico. In Texas, the Lipan Apaches, the same ones who had fought the bloody 9-day battle against the Comanches, well, in 1749, they were still clinging desperately to their lands, and it was in these lands that a story of trickery and survival unfolded. In that year of 1749, several Apache bands, including the Lipans, they rode their people into San Antonio in Texas. They were there to sign a peace treaty and to declare their desire to enter into mission life and, of course, become servants of the king in Spain and of God. These people had been raiding the Texans. These Apaches had been raiding the Texans since San Antonio's founding in 1718. So the Spanish, they were ecstatic that they were coming in to sign this treaty. The Apaches would actually ask the Spanish for years for peace. They would ask for peace, a presidio, and a mission. But especially the presidio, please. The Apaches wanted this fort and church. They wanted them in their homeland near modern-day Menard, Texas, which is in the dead center of Texas near San Angelo. Surprisingly, the Spanish eventually took the requests seriously, and they sent out 2 scouting expeditions in 1753 and 55. Technically, the Spanish had heard rumors that there were gold in them there hills, the hills of Hill Country, Texas. It also didn't hurt that yet again, the Spanish were leery of French encroachment. In 1756, a rich Spaniard named Don Pedro Romero de Terreros even offered to pay for the whole endeavor. He'd pay for 2 missions for 2 years in Apache country, so long as these missions were run by his cousin Alonso Geraldo de Terreros. The project was ultimately approved. The person in charge was a Colonel Padilla. He was a soldier with a lot of experience on the frontier. He had been governor of Sonora and Coahuila. He had also led successful campaigns against the Apache in western New Mexico. Well, he would be successful here in Texas as well. He imported 1,400 heads of cattle and 700 sheep after building the mission and the presidio. Padilla also arranged for the transfer of quite a few Tlaxcaltecan Indians from northern Mexico to help with the future conversions. Despite his success at first, Padilla was quite skeptical that the Apaches, a people he had fought and knew, he was highly skeptical that the Apaches were serious. In his gut, he knew the real reason for the possible conversions was because of the expensive, manned, and armed San Saba Presidio. He even wrote the viceroy in Mexico City and told him that the Apaches were treacherous and they were not going to make good on their word. Sure, every now and then a Lipan Apache would show up in San Antonio to proclaim their love of God and the crown, and they would ask for some beads or tobacco or for some hats. Or maybe, do y'all have any knives? Kettles? Could I have some ribbons before returning to my people? Some beef, maybe? For the most part, though, as Padilla noted, the Apaches, who this was all for, pretty much steered clear of the Spanish and their religious. S.C. Gwynn sarcastically writes of the Apaches at this time, quote, "On the eve of the move to the mission, when they should have been swooning in anticipation of simultaneously receiving Jesus and pledging allegiance to the Spanish king, none could be found." End quote. Surprisingly, on April 18th, 1757, the mission finally opened its doors. The mission and the presidio with 100 soldiers. But there wasn't a single Apache there to celebrate. One of the fathers was then sent to go find these Apaches and bring them to the church, but he had no luck. But then, miraculously, the Spanish and the religious, their luck turned around. And then some Apache were finally located. S.C. Gwynn, writer of the much-maligned Empire of the Summer Moon, he also writes of this turn of events when he wrote, quote, "Then in June, it seemed to the hopeful fathers that the miraculous moment had finally arrived. That month, they discovered some 3,000 Indians camped near the mission. This was more than they could have dreamed possible. But as the missionaries prepared to welcome their new charges, they learned the real reason for the gathering, the annual buffalo hunt. There was some talk of going north to fight other Indians too, but no talk at all of coming into the mission. The Indians soon vanished." S.C. Gwynn continues, "Padilla, now certain that he had been duped, wrote the viceroy." Quote, this is now Padilla writing to the viceroy. "Your Excellency will understand what a difficult undertaking is the formation of missions for the heathen Apache nation, and will see that the favorable reports that were sent in to the Captaincy General concerning the matter were direct results of the unreliability that has always characterized the missionaries and inhabitants of the province of Texas in every occurrence that has concerned them." End Padilla's quote. S.C. Gwynn continues, "Meanwhile, 3 of the 4 priests had also lost confidence in the venture, leaving Father Terreros as its sole supporter. 'We find no reason,' wrote the dissenting padres, 'why we should remain with this enterprise, which we consider ill-conceived and without foundation from the beginning. Having fully learned the wishes of the Indians, we find no other motive for friendship than the hope of receiving gifts.'" Padilla tried to abandon the mission project altogether, proposing that the presidio alone be moved north to protect the mines, with no success, though he was bitterly frustrated and not a little nervous about manning an outpost so far beyond the frontier. He had his viceregal orders. End all quotes. It seems Padilla did not think very highly of Texans or Apaches. This presidio, it had the desired effect of protecting the Apache, though, right? Not quite. As the months progressed, word from Apaches landed in the ears of the Padres. Word of a great invading army from the north that was on its way to destroy them. It was apparently a force so great that the Apaches believed the Spanish would not be able to protect them. This was probably tough for Padilla to swallow, seeing as how everything else the Apache had said had not come true, like their desire to convert and to become loyal Spanish citizens. But this time, what the Apaches had said was indeed the truth. I will quote S.C. Gwynn once again. Hopefully I won't lose anyone's favor, but I will quote S.C. Gwynn once again here because he writes quite well, even if he is lambasted constantly by historians and the Comanche themselves. I follow a few Comanches online who despise this book, and with good reason, but I'm steering clear of most of the controversial claims, and obviously just talking about the Apache here. But Gwynn writes, quote, "The San Saba mission proposal was indeed, as Padilla had suspected, a sham. The Lipans and other bands never had any intention of converting to Christianity. But what neither Padilla nor any Spanish official had understood was the reason for the deception. And thus, they had no idea of the extent of the treachery that had been perpetrated upon them. What had in fact happened, while the Padres were busy shining up their sacramental vessels, was that the Comanche Empire, an area far, far larger than any Spaniard suspected in those years, had arrived precisely on their doorstep. The Spanish had been cleverly lured well beyond the actual boundaries of the Apache lands. The San Saba country was not their homeland at all. It was Comancheria proper, and a Spanish fort there amounted to a declaration of war on the Comanches. This was exactly what the Apaches wanted. They wanted their dire enemy destroyed, or at least stopped in its relentless southward sweep." End quote. While it was a brilliant plan, getting the Spanish to fight the Apaches' battles for them, it was also a doomed one. And in the spring of 1758, the Comanches came riding hard under a full moon. On March 2nd, in the dead of night, the Comanches came and stole all 62 of the mission's horses. In response, Padilla sent out 15 soldiers. But these guys quickly realized they'd gotten in over their heads, and they returned with haste. Padilla now rode to the mission, where 3 priests and a handful of Indians and servants were protected by 5 soldiers. Only 5 soldiers. But he went there to beg Father Terreros to leave for the far greater security of the presidio. Of course, Father Terreros refused, and he insisted that the Indians would never harm him. You gotta love that friar zeal for suicide. Naturally, Terreros was wrong. On the morning of March 16th, 1758, Mass was interrupted. It was halted by the noise of whooping Indians. The fathers ran to see where the noise was coming from, but all they saw was the heart-stopping sight of black and red painted Indians in full war regalia. Comanches and Wichitas. They had muskets, bows and arrows, and lances, and the mission was completely surrounded. At first, the fathers gave the Comanche leaders gifts, but they didn't seem interested in them. The Comanches didn't really seem interested at all in anything until the killing began. Father Terreros died first after being shot, and then the soldier guarding him fell next. A few others were shot or bludgeoned or hacked to pieces. The mission was put to the flame. The dead priests were stripped, mutilated, and one of them was decapitated. In Frank C. Lockwood's The Apache Indians, he comments that during this attack, quote, "The wily Apaches suffered little, for only a few of them were present at the time of the attack." End quote. After the killing, the Comanches and Wichitas stole the cattle, the goods, the vestments, just everything they could get away with, really. 2 miles away, Padilla was told of the attack, and his response was to gather 9 soldiers to protect what was left of the mission. Nearly all 9 men were injured, with 2 dying immediately. The survivors, injured, somehow made it back to the Presidio. Most everyone, 10 people, died at the mission, but the Indians never attacked the fort. Perilla had asked for backup from other presidios, but none came. Actually, a few soldiers eventually arrived after the third viceroyal decree. The people of Texas were scared out of their minds. The whole northern frontier of New Spain was rocked. The Apaches had been right. Despite the French offering to broker some sort of peace deal, Perilla would gather 380 Spaniards and 134 Apaches to find and destroy the Comanches that had attacked the mission at San Saba. This large party would leave in August of 1759, and they'd stick to the eastern timber forests that clung to the side of the Great Plains in fear. Perilla would actually find an Indian village, but they would be Tonkawas. That was of no matter. He slaughtered them anyways. After all, an Indian's an Indian during a punitive raid, and maybe the Tonkawas were allied with the Comanches. 55 of the Tonkawas were killed, and 150 women and children were taken to San Antonio for conversion and assimilation, to put it kindly. Perilla and his Apache ally forces would then ride north between present-day Fort Worth and the Red River, which is the border of Texas and Oklahoma. And here, in these hills, they'd find a formidable group of Comanche, Wichita, Osage, Caddoan, and other tribes. And they were all backed by the might and cunning intrigue of the French. This group of Indians and French, I just love saying French like that. I have a lot of French friends in real life, so the ones listening know that I'm being facetious. But this group of Indians and the French, they were dug into defensive positions, and they were well armed. Clearly, Perilla and his men were in for a tough challenge. Except, as S.C. Gwynn writes, quote, "What happened next might have been one of the greatest slaughters in the history of the American West, except for the fact that Perilla's forces almost immediately turned tail and ran. Though his Spanish regulars had charged on his command, the rest of the army proved utterly feckless. Most of it melted away. Retreat turned into panic, and panic turned into headlong flight. For some reason, perhaps because they were so pleased to capture all of the provision wagons of a large Spanish army, the Indians did not pursue Perilla's terrified, fleeing army. Because of this, his forces suffered few casualties, an inconvenient fact that he was hard-pressed to explain to his skeptical superiors back in San Antonio and later in Mexico City." End quote. It was apparently the worst defeat inflicted upon the Spaniards in the New World, ever. Now, I know this episode is about the Apache, but like much of the history of the Southwest, it is intertwined and spiraled together with so many other peoples, nations, and histories. After this, no other punitive expeditions would ever again be sent against the Comanches in Texas, and no missions would ever again be built in hostile country. But about the Comanche, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that Don Juan Bautista de Anza and Don Maria y Pacheco, with his sons, and a whole lot of other Spanish soldiers, they go and defeat the great Comanche leader Greenhorn in Colorado in the 1780s, I believe. So the Spanish still do fight against the Comanche. Apparently, Perilla was sent to Mexico City to explain what had happened, and while he was there under oath, he claimed he had been up against 6,000 Indians under the command and flag of French officers. The court, though, disagreed, and they found no evidence of Frenchmen at the battle at all, and they also doubted the numbers of enemy combatants that Perilla had stated. The French were a thorn in the side of both the Spanish and the Apache. The French constantly supplied the Apaches with guns, which the Spanish feared, and the French also supplied the Comanche with guns, which the Apache feared. Everyone, it seems, feared the French guns. And speaking of feared French and the Apache, this has nothing to do with the Apache Indians of the American continent, well, except for the name. But let's go down this little fun tangent. In my research on French interactions with the Apache in the New World, which I found next to nothing about, but maybe it's just not in English, and I don't read French or speak it very well. But when researching the Apache and the French, I found that in the 1870s, Some 10,000 or so street ruffians and vagabonds in Paris were so brutal in their attacks on random people on the street that the French press compared them to the Apaches of America and Mexico. They dubbed these thugs the Apaches. Kinda goes to show how prevalent the belief of the violent Apache was even 150 years ago, on another continent, with a people who, to my knowledge, had very little interaction with the Apaches. These Apaches were no joke, though. Craig Gemainer, on the website Défense dans la Rue, says this of the Apache street fighters of Paris, quote, "The Apaches were prominently focused on their own form of street combat, however, crude and unscrupulous, yet highly effective. French Apache street fighting emphasized the use of elementary street kicks, hand strikes, headbutts, throws, and an assortment of weapons, both standard and improvised, which included knuckle dusters, knives, razors, scarves, bodkins, jackets, hats, the Apache gun, and even sheep bones. And the techniques of the French Apache were all set up with dirty tricks." End quote. Such as, one of the dirty tricks I saw on this website was that the Apaches would surround you on a staircase. One would go up behind you and become a table, while the other one would be in front of you and push you over the guy who was kneeling behind you, so you'd tumble down the stairs, and then they'd steal your stuff. These early 1900 Apaches in Paris, they even sparked a new dance craze called Apache Swing, which occasionally saw the participants in the dance die or be killed. The dance was so violent as it mimicked fighting that people would be thrown or stabbed or hit like they would be thrown across bars and tables. It sounds ridiculous. And Americans thought the twist was bad. Apparently, these Apache street fighting gangs were eradicated when they were systematically rounded up and sent to the front lines of World War I, where most of them, no doubt, died in a storm of steel. Back to the early 1700s New Spain, though. Padilla, after the disastrous failure in Texas, was reassigned and became a governor elsewhere in a few different places. Also, he put down another native rebellion, this time in Florida. But for a long time, this defeat at what is known as the Battle of Twin Villages was considered a huge disgrace for the Spanish. Many of the Texas Apaches would eventually merge into other Apache bands, but some would just simply disappear from history. But not before they had a few last stands while they were still in the area. Frank C. Lockwood writes that not long after this, the Spanish and the Comanche actually do indeed make peace, but that did not sit well with the Apache, who then began to raid some Comanche settlements. But as they raided and plundered these Comanche settlements, the Apache would leave behind clues for the Comanches to discover. Clues that suggested that the Spanish were the ones who were raiding and killing them, not the Apache, or at least that the Spanish were helping the Apache. But that wasn't quite enough, and the Apache actually began attacking Spanish settlements as the Spanish went further and further north. Despite this, though, the Apaches convinced the Spanish to build yet another mission and presidio in the Texas region. But by 1767, all of them, San Saba included, were abandoned by the Spanish. The Apaches' word on their conversion, it now meant nothing to the religious of the area, who, in a surprisingly un-Spanish Catholic friar way, suggested they retreat and abandon their pursuits in the region of Texas. The Apache would just have to keep living in sin. Forget them. By the mid-18th century, many of the alliances the Spanish had with the Apaches, they were disintegrating. And now, the Apaches had a pretty strong defensive line in the wilderness that stretched from Texas to Arizona. From the deserts, mountains, and canyons of Big Bend to the deserts, mountains, and canyons of Cactus Country in Arizona. The Apache would hide, fight, and raid from their mountain strongholds, and they would continue to make life unbearable for many Spaniards along a line of attack that was anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 miles long. It didn't help that the Spanish weren't really doing sending their best to the northern frontier. In many cases, the men sent to lead the presidios or govern the land were corrupt. They were greedy. They were prone to tyranny. They often didn't pay the soldiers well, and then, in many cases, the soldiers only sought to loot on account of not getting paid well enough by their presidio commanders. I mean, not everyone, of course, and not everywhere. but a large amount of the blame for the ill-ran northern boundary of New Spain and of New Mexico was on the heads of the Spanish themselves. And a large part of that ill-ran area of wilderness was a failure to control the Apaches along that enormous border. Frank C. Lockwood puts it perfectly when he wrote in the Apache Indians, quote, "The failure to control the Apaches was the fault of the Spanish government. It was their duty to see the fact that the adequate protection of the northern frontier absolutely demanded a coordinated and steadfast program, and it was obligatory upon them to devise and enforce such a program." End quote. Lockwood also quotes another historian named Dr. Charles Edwin Chapman, who wrote a book in 1916 called The Founding of Spanish California. In the quote by Chapman, he summarizes yet another quote by a Lieutenant Captain General, Pedro de la Vaquera, who was speaking to the king on the affairs and disarray in northern New Spain. Here is the quote from Lockwood's The Apache Indians. "Nowhere is there a better statement in brief space of the weakness and defects of the government in its dealings with the Apache problem than Dr. C. E. Chapman's summary of a memorial addressed to the king by Pedro de la Vaquera, who had long served in Mexico as Lieutenant Captain General." Quote by La Vaquera. "The Apaches, when attacked, habitually retired to the mountains which were inaccessible to the presidial troops. This was due not merely to the fact that the latter were cavalrymen, but to the nature of the soldiers themselves. Most of them were mulattoes, of very low character, without ambition, and unconquerably unwilling to travel on foot, as was necessary in a mountain attack. Moreover, their weapons carried so short a distance that the Apaches were wont to get just out of range and make open jest of the Spaniards. Furthermore, some presidio captains were more interested in making a personal profit out of their troops, arising from the fact that part of the latter's wages was paid in effects, than they were in subjugating the enemy. Nor did the various captains work in harmony when on campaigns. Continuance of the Apaches in Apacheria was in the highest degree prejudicial. Not only were they a hindrance to conquests toward the Colorado and in the direct route between Sonora and New Mexico, but also they endangered regions already held by Spain, leading subjected Indians, either from fear or from natural inclination, to abandon missions and villages, and whether in alliance with the Apaches or by themselves, to commit the same kind of atrocities as the Apaches did. La Vaquera recommended that 200 mountain fusiliers of Spanish blood be recruited in Spain, equipped among other things with guns of long range, and dispatched to New Spain for service against the Apaches. These men, under a disinterested leader, would quickly subject the Apaches, and might then be given lands in the region." End all quotes. This request for 200 mountain fusiliers of Spanish blood, and in this context, a fusilier would be like a sharpshooter, a rifleman essentially, a sniper. But the request for 200 snipers to go take out the Apache in their mountain strongholds never materialized. But the Spanish understood that the Apache threat was different from other threats they'd faced previously, and that made their interactions with them more militarized. One way the Spanish tried to subjugate the Apache was by using other Indians in the northern frontier as a buffer, like the aforementioned O'odham, as I talked about in the last episode. But the Apaches grew so powerful and strong in this area of the Southwest that by the 1760s, many O'odham in Arizona and northern Mexico and New Mexico had been kicked out of their old canyons and mountain strongholds, and they began concentrating around Spanish towns like Tucson and San Xavier del Bac. I know I talked a lot about the Apaches' arrival into the area of the American Southwest in the last episode, and I know I ruled out a myth in the beginning of this episode, but knowing when the Apache entered the wild and woolly West, it's key in understanding their relationships with their neighbors. One important fact I did not really learn about or even think about when studying the Apache origins was the fact that the O'odham groups and the Puebloans, they traded pretty frequently and without problems right up until the mid or late 1600s, which was the same time the Apaches got there. So the Puebloans of the Santa Fe Rio Grande region and the O'odham of the Hohokam areas of southern Arizona and northern Mexico, which is quite a distance, a vast distance, but these two groups traded regularly without interruption until the late 1600s. The same time the Apache arrived and began disrupting this once harmonious exchange. It's also important to note that when Coronado went through the area in the 1540s, he claimed the space between these two groups, the Pima or O'odham, and the Puebloans. This space was uninhabited. That is a vast area of the Gila Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains, the deserts and hills and canyons and petrified forests of eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. The Mogollon Rim is in there. El Malpais. Revisionist historians and new up-and-coming historians, they love to prove their old professors or scholars of a past era wrong. I mean, I even pushed the date of arrival of the Apache back in my last episode, when I cited the Montezuma Castle evidence. But it could be quite possible that the Apache weren't in the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest until after the Spanish arrived and explored. But before, just right before, the Spanish came and set up camp in northern Sonora and New Mexico. It does make sense, too. What preceded the Spanish arrival to the area was their diseases, which decimated the Americas, which would have depopulated many areas, which would have made it easier for the Apache to infiltrate the Southwest, while they were getting pushed out of the Great Plains. I mean, this is a place that had been largely devoid of most of its previous inhabitants for over 200 years by then, after the Great Migrations to Paquimé and the Rio Grande. Not to mention, the O'odham apparently attempted to colonize or migrate to the Rio Grande area as well, but they were stopped by the Apache. Absolutely, the Apache were, probably, I say absolutely, but probably they were on the Great Plains by the 15th century, or at least the 16th. They were on the Great Plains with their dogs, pulling their homes and belongings as they followed the bison and planted the occasional crop. It was a pretty great setup. But I am still unsure of when they arrived to the land of sharp mountains and sharper thorns. I'm not sure we'll ever answer the question of when the Apache arrived to the American Southwest. But one thing is certain, they definitely made their presence known once they'd arrived. The 1700s were a violent time in the West, way away from the plains. And this was between the Spanish, their Indian allies and neighbors, and the Apache. John Upton Tyrrell states that during this time between 1748 and 1770, quote, the Apache killed more than 4,000 persons and stole or destroyed property valued in excess of 12 million pesos. In a period of less than 3 years, 140 settlers were murdered. More than 7,000 horses and mules were stolen, and large numbers of sheep and cattle, which the Apache had been unable to drive off, were slaughtered by them in pastures. End quote. Of course, the Apache suffered greatly as well, with many carried into slavery or killed in skirmishes with the Spanish. But far fewer Apache in number died than Spaniard, mostly because the numbers of the Apache were so much smaller. In the mid-18th century, and really in the 19th century as well, but in the mid-1700s, the Apache population could reasonably be stated at being between 5,000 and 7,000 men, women, and children. And all of them were spread out along that massive Apacheria. And those numbers come from a Father Juan Nentwig, or Johann Nentwig, in 1764. And more on him in just a bit. Also, these numbers come from Visitador Pedro de Rivera in 1728, and by archaeologist Edward Spicer. If you were wondering, a visitador was someone appointed by the king to visit the various regions of the kingdom. And Edward Spicer is the quite famous anthropologist who worked on many sites in the American Southwest. He was a very knowledgeable man who influenced a lot of later archaeology and anthropology in the American Southwest. As I mentioned in the first Apache episode, a major problem the Spanish had in dealing with these relatively low-populated Apaches was the lack of a central figurehead. The Spanish just couldn't make a deal and have every single Apache follow it under threat of their leader. That's just not the way the Apache worked. But sometimes a treaty could be struck and peace would reign in one Spanish region or city or town or area, as the Apaches promised to leave the Spanish be. But then the warriors would just go raid a neighboring settlement that didn't have the same peace plan in place. And then, on top of that, the Apache warriors would return to the settlements that they had a peace agreement with and trade the goods that they'd just stolen from the Spanish neighbors. In Max Moorehead's The Apache Frontier, he comments at length about this problem when he wrote, quote, "In a sense, the Apaches held the Spanish frontiersmen in tributary vassalage, extracting from the settlers and their subject Indians a never-ending subsidy. Yet neither side was satisfied with the arrangement, and both preyed upon the other when occasion permitted." End quote. And then, inevitably, something would happen, and the peace that one settlement would make with the Apaches would fall apart, and the raiding and killing would begin again. And this happened over and over and over again all over the Spanish frontier. It was noted in the 1760s by the aforementioned Jesuit missionary Juan Nentvig that the Apaches previously, quote, "attacked only 2 or 3 times a year, always at full moon. Now they attack at any time and in large numbers." End quote. In 1773, a third attack on the city of Tubac by the Apaches. This attack saw 130 of the best horses in Sonora stolen. These horses had been practically handpicked by the great explorer, Indian fighter, and Spanish statesman, that is, Captain Anza. A man we will talk about again soon, but also a man that we have talked about before. He had chosen these horses, Anza had chosen these very horses to explore California with. But now they belonged to the Apache. The next year, in 1774, the Apache stole 300 more horses from the town of Fronteras. In May, they stole 30 more from Tubac. In September, they stole 36 mail-carrying horses. On top of all that, as Frank C. Lockwood puts it, at the same time as these thefts from the forts and major cities, quote, "individual settlers, miners, wood choppers, and ranchmen in lonely places were being robbed and murdered." End quote. Some of these attacks were blamed on the fact that the Sobai-Puris, Native Americans, they abandoned their villages up north, which left no buffer zone between the Apaches and the Spanish. Another padre would comment at the same time that there was no way Christianity could spread further north until the people the Spanish at this time called Los Crueles Barbaros Apaches, or the cruel Apache barbarians, were quote-unquote stopped. In 1775, a General Don Hugo O'Connor was given 2,000 soldiers, or flying squadron men. He was also given settlers and Indian allies to hunt down and punish these Apaches, and possibly retrieve some of those many stolen horses. Now, Frank C. Lockwood sums up this campaign nicely. "It was his purpose to strike the Indian hip and thigh, front and rear, in camp and on the move, buffeted from this direction and that, whether they stood or retreated, they were to be found, repulsed, and beaten. 15 defeats of devastating proportions were administered to the Apaches during this campaign. The Spaniards killed in all 104 of the enemy and recaptured nearly 2,000 animals." End quote. The next year, which is 1776, General O'Connor again went on the offensive, killing nearly 30 Apaches. Up north, good old Fray Francisco Garces, that elusive man from the D&E series. But Garces was up in Zuni in October when he wrote about how the Apaches have been slowly and curiously returning to their old homes and haunts up in the north, up in New Mexico. They were also bringing their families and horses and all their belongings, and they were inquiring about a certain peace with the Spanish. It seems these campaigns in the south were somewhat working, at least from the Spanish perspective. From the Apache perspective, it was no doubt devastating. Another favorite but expensive way that the Spanish attempted to stop these attacks from the Apache at this time in the 1700s, well, really all the time, but a favorite way for the Spanish to defend themselves was to build these presidios that I keep talking about. And boy, did the Spanish build them some presidios in the 1700s. They actually built a line of them along that northern boundary of New Spain. General O'Connor was actually in charge of selecting many of the sites for these future presidios. Although he was relieved of his duty in 1777 when his health began to fail. In 1782, the Spanish crown in northern New Spain built a presidio in Tubac and manned it with O'odham warriors. Those are the people that I talked about in the previous episode. They were an important people to the region and its history. Well, at this time, the O'odham got their very own company. This presidio was actually first built to prevent O'odham uprisings, which had happened recently, like a la Pueblo revolt style. But now the presidio, manned by O'odham, was to guard against the Apache. And they were mostly guarding the Tucson area. The year before that, in 1781, a Theodore de Croix, an important man I will mention again soon, but de Croix said that the area, Sonora, was, quote, submerged in Apache hostilities, end quote. In 1782, the Apache raided the Presidio of Tucson with 600 warriors, which was an unusually high number of Apache warriors. The battle was so fierce that some Apache occupied the houses within the fort's walls. And then a few months later, the Apaches raided yet again. But this time they drove off all the livestock at the fort. After that attack, the Spanish mounted a flying defense and chased the Apaches into the thorny wilderness. They actually caught up to a few of them and killed 7 of the Apaches. After their deaths, quote, the soldiers cut off 7 of their heads, as is our custom, end quote. Ooh. That quote was by Tucson Presidio's commander, a man named Pedro Allende y Saavedra. And he said that the heads they cut off were put next to the, quote, lines of countless Apache heads that have crowned the palisade, end quote. That's quite a sight to picture. 100 years later, when a man I will talk about in the next episode, a man named Mangas Coloradas, or Red Sleeves, when Mangas Coloradas went into an American camp to establish peace, he was met with death. Mangas Coloradas, his men watched the White Eyes, or Americans. They watched the soldiers kill him, dig a shallow ditch, and bury him. Only for the soldiers to come back the next day, dig him up, decapitate his body, and boil his head in a big black kettle. In that book I'm reading for subscribers, Inde, an Apache Odyssey by Yves Ball, the narrator, Dekluji, he talks to the author, Yves Ball, about this extremely brutal dismemberment that happened to the Apaches. He says, quote, to an Apache, the mutilation of the body is much worse than death, because the body must go through eternity in the mutilated condition, end quote. He goes on to say that before this mutilation of Mangas Coloradas, the Apache never practiced mutilation against the White Eyes. Only after this dismemberment did the brutality start. He tells Yves Ball, quote, while there was little mutilation previously, it was nothing compared to what was to follow. I have seen things done. Every Apache who lived through those terrible times saw them. A little later he states, quote, there was no attempt to protect the women and children from knowledge of what occurred. They saw mutilation in many forms, end quote. As previously mentioned, the Apache were in fact, in the 1700s, long before Dekluji's story that I just read, but the Apache were known to cut the heads off priests. I have even read some of those accounts to y'all. So maybe Dekluji meant only his band or his people. Occasionally in his great storytelling, he will completely contradict himself, which is fine. It's still a great book and story. And it's from the Apache perspective, which is often rare if you can't tell for this episode especially, which is mostly told from the Spanish perspective. I promise, future episodes, there's more from the Apache perspective, especially in the 1800s. Dakluji actually goes on to talk about scalping as well. He says to Eve Ball, quote, "Why are White Eyes so squeamish about scalping? It was White Eyes who started it. The Indians of the east and of the plains practiced it a little, but not until both Mexicans and White Eyes scalped some of our people did Apaches resort to it. And anyways, the dead feel nothing. After all, there's nothing to it. You just put your foot on a man's neck. We never scalped women. You run your knife around the hairline and peel the skin off." End quote. That fact may be true about Apaches not scalping the Mexicans or White Eyes or Spanish. I have not yet ran into a story about the Apaches scalping anyone, at least up to this point. But right there, Dakluji kind of contradicts himself when he says we don't mutilate because then you go throughout life, the afterlife, mutilated. And then he says, well, yeah, we scalp people, but only after you guys started it. A lot of the book is like that. It's great, though. I hope that everyone signs up to listen. Dakluji will be quoted from quite a bit in the next couple of episodes, however many there are. So, back to our story here. The Spanish would often catch up to fleeing Apaches after these kind of raids, and the unlucky ones would be killed. Killed and mutilated clearly by the Spanish. The ones that didn't get killed were no doubt sold into slavery by the Spanish and their native allies. Although, of course, the Spanish didn't call them slaves, but rather criados, from the Spanish word criar, or to raise, as in to raise up from childhood. Most of these slaves were taken as children. The adult males were killed, obviously. Women were, unfortunately, occasionally sold into prostitution or household servitude. But also, they would be converted, and that would be the justification. The Spaniards taught these criado children Spanish and Christianity, and these slaves, while illegal, made up the quote-unquote servant class of northern New Spain. Again, having slaves was highly illegal, but the Spanish justified it by calling it something else and by teaching them Christianity and saying they were saving their souls. They could also sell them between other Spaniards, which was another highly illegal activity. But Mexico City and Madrid were just so far away. Local leaders were often corrupt and sometimes even in on the enslaving. Plus, it was very tough to enforce these borderlands, right there at the edge of Apacheria. In a 1798 census of the Sonoran town of Arizpe, it was found that of the 52 Apache children and young adults, almost all were servants in Spanish households. While all of this slaveholding and Apache child kidnapping may have helped some of the better-off Spanish households on the northern frontier, it certainly did not help the O'odham people surrounding the Presidios. Naturally, the Apaches took their own captives as revenge. The Apache took both O'odham and Spanish prisoners. So Spanish slavery wasn't helping anyone. It rarely helps anyone, if ever. At the end of the 18th century, the Apache were raiding the O'odham's villages regularly. This was especially true near the San Pedro River. The O'odham were so hard hit that they'd eventually abandon the area completely. And part of this area is what's known as Aravaipa Canyon, the very place that the Apache kid and his people were from, except later on. Obviously, before the Apache, for who knows how long, the beautiful fertile canyon known as Aravaipa belonged to the O'odham. So the Sobaipuri and O'odham had abandoned their villages, leaving only the Spanish and their expensive forts to guard against Apache attacks. We have been talking a lot about the Apaches and the fact that they fought a lot, obviously. But how did they fight? How did they do their killing and their raiding? I had just assumed they did it with the bow and arrow, but I would have been only somewhat correct. In the late 1700s, a Father Ignaz Pfefferkorn wrote a book called Sonora, a description of the province, which he spent a good deal of time talking about the Apaches, including how they fought. Apparently, and not surprisingly, the Apache were quite lethal with the bow and arrow. Pfefferkorn wrote, quote, "The Apache are incomparable archers and seldom miss," end quote. Another author and Spaniard from the time, a Bernardo de Galvez, wrote in his 1786 Instructions for Governing the Interior Provinces of New Spain that the first arrow from these Apaches archers, the first arrow they would fire, was so lethal that the arrow could penetrate both the Spaniard's shield and his famous, 7 or 8 layered leather jacket. Unfortunately for the Apache, though, their bowstrings got more and more loose with each arrow they fired, but they were quick to do repairs and to restring, get the string tense again. They were quick to do that on the fly while fighting. These are just things we moderns and our composite bows don't even really think about. But this is something an Apache had to deal with in every single engagement. So if a Spaniard survived the first arrow, it was in his best interest to charge at the Apache, at least if he missed with his musket, which we will talk about soon. The Spanish were famous for not being able to hit the broadside of a barn. But if he missed and he had to charge, he would have to watch out for the Apache's lance, which they apparently grasped with both hands for an overhead thrust, which they used when on foot. This overhead thrust was also quite lethal. I can't really picture what an overhead thrust with a lance would look like, unless it's that scene from Troy where Brad Pitt jumps over the dude and stabs him in the chest and neck. Anyways. Eventually, the Apaches acquired the rifle or musket. At first, they did not acquire these from the Spanish, instead from the aforementioned French. It did not take long for the Apache to use the musket effectively and accurately, though. My wife and I just visited the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, and on display was an authentic war club, but it was from the eastern United States, and this war club was made from the stock of a rifle. This warrior then affixed a sharp steel blade to the top and used the rifle as a club or an axe. That's how a lot of Native Americans first treated the gun. Other tribes would tear guns apart and use each individual piece. Others would decorate their gun but not really use them. And this is partly because ammo was so scarce or the guns traded were defective. But the Apache, they learned how to use firearms as God intended. The only drawback, of course, was the fact that an Apache could shoot up to 10 arrows in the same time it took to shoot once and then reload. These were muskets. So you put in the powder and then you put in the ball and then you tamp them down and then you shoot. And I don't think they were rifled. So the musket ball could fly pretty inaccurately, or not as accurate as we are used to today with a rifled, the bullet spinning for those that don't know. Just imagine the opening of a James Bond movie. That's what rifling is. That's spinning. That same Bernardo de Galvez, who wrote about the Apache's lethality with the bow, he also wrote that since it took so long for the Apache to reload, the Spanish should give the Apache more rifles so that the playing field would be more even. Galvez hoped the Apache would also forget how to use the bow and arrow completely, and they would start depending on the Spaniards for their rifles, ammunition, and repairs. More on that in a bit. He actually kind of gets his way. The Apache, though, would not soon forget how to use a bow. The Apache also chose when and where to fight, and this made them even more lethal. They'd often spring a trap, shoot and loot, and then flee to the mountains. If things didn't go the Apache's way during a battle, the Apache had no qualms fleeing for the hills. Obviously, the Spanish thought this was cowardice. But on the other hand, it was noted by other Spanish authors of the time that often, when an Apache or a group were surprised by the Spaniards, they would often resist and fight until they were exhausted and captured or killed. Regardless, an offer of peace to the Apache warrior was an offer of weakness, and the Apache were not weak people. In 1776, something happened in the colonies of New Spain and New Mexico that I have previously talked about. I believe that was in the Dominguez and Escalante series. 1776 was, of course, the same year that D&E expedition left, but it was also the year the Crown had to shake things up if it still wanted to control its far-flung colonies. And that far-flung colonies included New Mexico, Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya, the northern part of New Spain. This far-flung colonies, northern part of New Spain, that were racked with Apache warfare. So in that year, King Charles III, after long quorums with his Council of the Indies and other officials and governors and just anyone who had his ear, well, in that year, the king decided to put the area of northern New Spain and New Mexico in the hands of a special military government. No more viceroys or corrupt civilian leaders. It was time to place the area under martial law. And the man in charge of this martial law was Don Theodore de Croix, and he was essentially awarded supreme authority. The following year, Don de Croix would enlist another great man and Indian fighter, a man I have talked about, Don Juan Bautista de Anza. He enlisted him to be the governor of New Mexico. A year later, in 1778, as Don de Croix completed his inspection of the northern part of New Spain and New Mexico, he came to the realization that the biggest threat to the region was, in fact, the Apache. And the Apache weren't no piddly problem neither. John Upton Tyrrell wrote that, quote, "The problems they had created were formidable. From every quarter, reports poured in telling of destroyed towns, settlers murdered, women and children slaughtered or carried into captivity, supply trains taken, missions burned, troops defeated, livestock stolen. From Texas to the California border, from northern New Mexico deep into Mexico, the Apache and their allies controlled the country." End quote. Something had to be done. And Don de Croix was the man to do it. Unfortunately for him, he had to get it done through the immense and decaying bureaucracy of the late Spanish Empire. A lot of his plan was to build presidios, but the funds never came. Political jealousies hampered him at every turn. He was seriously slowed by this aging empire. But eventually, after 1780, his plan came into effect. It did help that he forced ranches and mines and those with means to pay taxes to help fund their own defense. And these defenses included more presidios, 15 of them. This is actually the line of presidios I mentioned earlier. Between these forts, he also kept a strong patrol of well-paid guards that patrolled the sectors, especially the places hardest hit by the Apache. These presidios, they were expensive. And in each one there was a captain, a lieutenant, a chaplain, an alferez, or junior officer, a sergeant, 2 corporals, 40 men, and 10 Indian scouts, plus the patrolmen mentioned a moment ago between each presidio, and these presidios were spaced out about 100 miles apart. Of course, these forts were rarely, if ever, manned with that many men. Usually, they were understaffed, and a lot of the men were doing necessary labor to keep themselves fed, since many presidios were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by no civilians because they didn't want to be killed or captured by the Apache. It was tough to gather people to come to these forts and live, which was the whole point of having the forts. So the soldiers ended up doing a lot of farming and gardening, but they were also in charge of guarding mail routes, which took them away from the Presidio. Or they were guarding missions and the fathers. And they also had to spend a considerable amount of time and energy and men to guard the horse herds on account of the Apaches constantly stealing them. Remember when I just read about all those horses that the Apaches stole from the Presidios around Tucson? The Apaches, they stole horses for two reasons. One was to use them, obviously, in their raids, but the other was to eat them. The Apache loved the taste of horse meat, and they often would slaughter horses and eat the still warm flesh while being pursued after a raid. One of the reasons the Apache loved horse meat so much is because they had been pushed off of their buffalo hunting lands by the Comanche quite recently. But also in the dry deserts of the American Southwest, the buffalo didn't really roam. The next best thing to bison was the horse. The Apache, remember, were not native to the region known as Apacheria in southern Arizona and New Mexico and far southwest Texas. But they were adept at adapting to the harsh environment. In the Time Life Old West books I love to look through, Benjamin Capps writes in The Indians, that's the name of the book, The Indians, he writes about the Apache and their adaptations. He wrote that by the 1750s, the Apache had, quote, been pushed into some of the driest reaches of the Southwest, a wasteland consisting of rocky mountains, eroded breaks, and sandy plains, offering little sustenance for horses or for people. Through necessity, they quickly learned to live in this harsh country, to travel through it afoot like the coyote or mountain lion, to blend in so that they were nearly invisible. They became, in the words of an admiring commentator, quote, one of the toughest human organisms the world has ever seen, end quote. Under the circumstances, the horse was often more valuable to them as food than as transportation. End all quotes. And I love that description of the Apache. One of the toughest human organisms the world has ever seen. I wish I knew who wrote that. I could not find that. By law, in the late 1700s, each soldier had to have 7 of their own horses and 1 mule. Every single soldier. That meant the Presidios, in theory, had to have 350 horses and 50 mules that needed to be guarded. Obviously, the Apache were adept at stealing a few here and there undetected, but also, as mentioned earlier, sometimes they would get away with a whole lot of them. And that meant the Presidios and the mounted leather jacket companies were without mounts. The soldiers at the Presidios, on top of not always doing a lot of soldiering, they got paid in essentially company script that they could only use at the Presidio, so they weren't obviously incentivized to be good soldiers. And on top of that, the soldiers' captains made a lot of profit off of these soldiers and their pay. So after an attack by the Apaches on the Presidio, oftentimes, if it was a dangerous-looking vendetta mission or a mission that may have a lethal outcome, the captains would often not force his men to pursue, since if his men died, he made less money. Then there's the matter of a soldier's training, or rather, lack thereof. The aforementioned Pfefferkorn once witnessed a soldier load the musket ball before the gunpowder. He said of this, quote, if he but knows how to sit firmly in the saddle, things which the Sonorans are in general well able to do, he is a finished soldier. End quote. So essentially, if the man can ride a horse, he's sent out there. It is important to note Pfefferkorn's bias. He was a priest who did not like the military option. Later in the century, the 1700s, a man we will shortly discuss, Bernardo de Galvez, he would also remark that the soldiers' accuracy on the frontier was less than desirable, as the hitting of targets rarely happened. And Dequoy would later remark that most of the men he saw were, quote, ignorant of the use of these weapons, end quote. These weapons being the musket. Regardless of all these drawbacks, though, the strategy of the forts, it seemed to work, at least off and on, towards the end of the 18th century. According to John Upton Tyrrell, quote, Dequoy's strategy was to keep the Lipan, Mescalero, Gila, and other Apache bands under attack as much as possible, end quote. And again, it seemed to work for a time. The Spanish forces became more victorious against the Apaches, more victorious than they ever had been before. Attacks by the Apaches ceased, or slowed. Raids, too, they slowed. Death, destruction, theft, they all became, over the next few years, almost non-existent, or at least greatly reduced. But then, bureaucracy struck again, and in 1783 the Spanish crown told Don Dequoy to cease all hostilities with the enemy, be it Apache or otherwise, and only fight if there's an extreme necessity to do so. This made absolutely no sense to the civilians and soldiers and leaders up in northern New Spain, especially Dequoy, but orders are orders. Shortly afterwards, Dequoy was transferred to Peru. This special military government that I talked about, it was disbanded. And the provinces went back into the control of the viceroy in Mexico City. It is not surprising that corruption immediately flowed into the colonies once again, and the peace by the sword that Dequoy had found disappeared. As John Upton Tyrrell puts it, quote, the Apache struck viciously on all salients, and the interior provinces once again suffered from the destructive, murderous raiding, end quote. It would take yet another strong Indian fighting man to fix the problem. After that John Upton Tyrrell quote, I kind of thought it was important to also tell his bias, and his bias, despite me taking these quotes of the Apache, him calling them murderous and vicious attacks and destructive. All those things happened, so that's how you describe them. But in his opening, John Upton Tyrrell, in his Apache Chronicle, The Story of the People, he says in the author's note how distorted the Apache view has been by the whites and the Mexicans and the Spanish. We could write, the Apache could not. Everything that we learn about the Apache is through that lens. And also, the victors always write the history. But one of his quote at the very end of the author's note says, the distorted image of the Apache that is still disseminated through various mediums, that is still accepted by unthinking and uninformed people, was created by white men, not by the Apache. He rails against how people see the Apache and of just being violent and terrible and rapacious and evil, essentially. I don't want you to think that I'm only using biased sources that are against the Apache. I don't think I use any of those. The closest would be maybe Frank C. Lockwood's The Apache Indians from the early 1900s. But even that is sympathetic. I just wanted to say that before we continue on. I don't want to be painted as someone who is just calling these Indians, these Apaches, I'm not falling into the same story or the same narrative that has been written about them since the 1870s, possibly even before that. I've read some quotes by the Spanish about the Apache. And obviously I was not there. None of us were there. Life was tough back then, and the Apache were violent and brutal. And so were the Spanish. That's just history. The strong Indian fighting man to fix the problem, was Bernardo de Galvez. And in 1786, the previously mentioned author of Instructions for the Governing of the Interior Provinces of New Spain, Bernardo de Galvez, he was the newly appointed viceroy down in Mexico City. Galvez had actually been injured in 1771 during an attack against the Apaches, which is probably how he was able to write so well of their battle tactics. After that injury, Galvez decided that things needed to be shaken up with regards to fighting their enemy, It had been over 100 years of brutal campaigns against the Apaches after all. Galvez's answer was borrowed from the Spanish campaigns in North Africa. And it was pretty simple, really. Give the people, give the Apache rations and they will calm down. Except it wasn't quite that simple. And John Upton Terrell rather dramatically states that the plan was, quote, the most dishonest and brutal plan for the pacification of Indians ever devised by a supreme commander since the first Spaniards set foot on the North American mainland. End quote. Is Galvez's plan harsh and effective? Yes. Is it the most dishonest and brutal plan? I don't think so, but you get to be the judge. Galvez proposed that two groups of Apaches be identified. Peaceful Apaches and Apaches at war. The Apaches that settled around the various presidios, which that was the offer. Galvez offered all Apache, come and live by the presidios, or we will fight to the death. So the Apaches that settled around the various presidios would be given weekly rations of meat, grain, brown sugar, and tobacco. So just the essentials, really. They would also be given clothing and blankets, and they would be called the Peaceful Apaches. Now, that wasn't the total destruction of the Apache, which a lot of people wanted. A lot of these civilians and soldiers up here in the far-flung colonies, that's what they wanted, including Galvez himself, actually. But he said about this plan that, quote, a bad peace with all the tribes which ask for it would be more fruitful than the gains of a successful war. End quote. These peaceful Apaches that settled around the presidios became known as Apaches de Paz, or Peace Apaches. And these Peace Apaches would in turn for getting rations, they must go out on patrols with the Spanish against the ones who refused to settle. The Viceroy Galvez said of those Apache, the ones that refused to settle, that, quote, war must be waged without intermission in all of the provinces against the Apaches who have declared it. End quote. And every Apache who refused the rations, therefore, had declared war. As usual, this would end up being a brutal affair, with many Apache captured and sent away to work. At first, they were sent to Mexico City, but on that long 1,500-mile journey, many captured Apache would escape and make their way back to the northern frontier of modern-day Arizona and Sonora. As those who listened to my Apache Kids series know, captured Apaches really like to escape. So the Spanish had to improvise, and they chose to begin sending the Apaches on ships to the Caribbean, specifically Cuba, where they worked on sugar plantations. And that was not work that many of them survived. And this also reminds me of why the Apache were so afraid to go to Florida later when the Americans threatened it. That threat may have been why the Apache Kid and his Confederates mutinied in the first place. But that's 100 years in the future. This policy by Galvez in 1786 had other aspects to it as well. Apart from rations of food being handed out, the Spanish also gave the Apache defective firearms. And when I hear that, I just imagine them falling apart after shooting like some kind of Looney Tunes scene. And actually, that isn't really far from the truth. In Max Moorhead's Apache Frontier, he states that, quote, the muskets should be long ones. These would be awkward for the Indian to use while on horseback. They should also have weakened barrels, stock, and bolts, making them easily damaged and in continuous need of readjustment, repair, and replacement by skilled Spanish gunsmiths. End quote. So Galvez was going to give the Apache defective firearms that needed constant repair if they worked at all. And what goes best with defective firearms? Well, liquor, of course. Along with the food, tobacco, and defective firearms, the Spanish also began handing out hard liquor to the Apache. Now, I'm not being flippant about this. But we all know what liquor does to American Indians. All people, I suppose. But it was no different for the Apaches than it was for other Indians, who on top of the occasional tiswind benders, they would now have Spanish-provided high alcohol content spirits. Many Apache would never fully recover from this introduction of poison. So maybe John Upton Tyrrell was right with his dramatic assessment. These rations and guns were passed out at places like Tucson and Janos. And I've spoken about Janos a few times. It's that far-flung area where Dominguez would pass away at. It's also where Mierda was stationed. He was at the Presidio of San Felipe Santiago de Janos, in the modern-day Mexican state of Chihuahua. This would have been quite some time after Mierda y Pacheco had fought. Shortly after the policy was enacted, the Franciscan friars noticed an unwelcome change in the Apache and wrote that many of them were now a totally different people. They were stupefied from the liquor, and they began gambling more, cursing, and adopting more immorality. Certainly to the Spanish, this campaign against the Apaches proved to be rather successful. The raids never fully stopped, but they certainly slowed enough to allow an entire generation of Spaniards to know peace with the Apache. Meanwhile, up in New Mexico, Governor Anza had successfully put a stop to an alliance that had formed between the Navajo and the Gila Apache. For years, these two groups had conducted raids deep down into Mexico before hiding in the amazingly beautiful but rugged Gila Mountains wilderness. To accomplish this, Anza had built a military presence between the two tribes on the Rio San Jose. And that Rio San Jose sorta follows I-40 from the west and turns down into the Rio Grande near I-25. It turns south at the Laguna Pueblo. The river separates the western half of the state, really. It cuts off the northern Navajos from the southern Gila area. After that military presence, he had the troops move up from Mexico City into the Gila wilderness, and he inflicted some severe damage on the Apache there. So in the Gila wilderness, the Apache were feeling pressure from both the south and the north. At the same time, Anza declared that any Navajo found south of this river would be taken prisoner and punished in Santa Fe. His final act against the Apaches in this era was to forbid any and all trade and communications between the Navajo, the Puebloans, and the Apache. This was just simply too much for the Navajo, who depended heavily on trade with the Puebloans. So many Navajo came to Santa Fe to beg Anza to allow the trade, which he did, but only if the Navajo accompanied the Spanish on raids against their former allies and cousins, the Apache. For their own survival, the Navajo obliged. The Gila Apaches were then forced even further south. On other fronts, as I've talked about before, Anza successfully subdued the Comanche and even the Utes. And Anza was truly an enlightened leader of New Mexico. One of the few, probably. By the time Anza left office in 1787, John Upton Tyrrell states that, quote, Comanche, Pueblo, Ute, and even some apostate Apache were serving as auxiliaries under the Spanish flag. End quote. And that is quite an accomplishment. Eventually, 300 Chiricahua accepted Spanish protection in Sonora. Many bands came down from the mountains of southern Arizona and New Mexico, and they lived around the Presidios. Only the Lipan Apaches were denied peace, and that was only because of an entanglement of alliances between the Spanish and the Comanche. The Comanche, you see, they needed to raid someone, and if the Lipan were allied with the Spanish, then a raid on the Lipan by the Comanches, who were also allied with the Spanish, would force the Spanish to retaliate against the Comanche. What tangled webs we weave. But generally, the region was experiencing a truly unprecedented peace. There was so much peace in the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest that a ton more Spaniards moved to the area. Mines opened up. Ranches were built. Towns and cities were erected. By 1800, 1,000 people were living along the Santa Cruz River. Carl Jacobi, in Shadows at Dawn, sums it all up nicely with this long quote. Galvez's reforms witnessed the settlement of large numbers of Apaches in establecimientos de paz. By 1793, royal census revealed 1,995 Apaches living at various settlements in the far north, a number that increased over time as new bands entered into agreements with Spanish villages. To some, the military-run establecimientos de paz, with their regular gifts of grain, meat, cigarettes, and piloncillo, represented a sad departure from the lofty goals of the missions. Rather than civilizing the Indians as the Jesuits and Franciscans had done, the military, it seemed, encouraged a degrading idleness. Drunkenness, tobacco, and cards were the gods of the Apaches de Paz, lamented Ignacio Zuniga of Tucson in 1835. Yet even Zuniga had to acknowledge that the new policy had brought tranquility to much of Sonora. The region from Janos to Tucson, in Zuniga's words, a bloody theater of war for 100 years, soon had more than 50 rancherias de paz, and the countryside began once again to be filled with ranchos and haciendas that offered the beautiful vision of peace and abundance. No longer exposed to constant Apache raids, Sonora's population rose, and Sonorenses accumulated enormous livestock holdings. By 1804, Tucson boasted some 1,000 inhabitants and a herd of 3,500 cattle, 2,500 sheep, and 1,200 horses grazing outside its presidio walls. End all quotes. This whole period of peace lasted until the 1830s and saw the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest transformed. Establecimientos de paz, or establishments of peace, and peace, paz, it truly spread amongst the Spaniards and the Apaches, for the most part. But a different threat was looming for the Spanish. And it wasn't just the Comanches. And this threat would threaten the uneasy peace with the Apaches. I didn't know this until researching for this episode, but by this time, in the late 1700s, the Spanish were quite leery of an American-style independence movement among their Spanish and mestizo populations in the New World. A mind virus was spreading throughout the globe, which had begun in the Atlantic East. This virus was spreading in much the same way it had spread over 100 years before amongst the Indians of northern New Spain, when they had risen up shortly after the Puebloans had in New Mexico. Revolutions beget revolutions. This virus had even jumped the ocean and was infecting the Spaniards' neighbors to the north, the French. In this era of the end of the 18th century, the Spanish crown lived in constant fear of their subjects rising up against them like the Americans had against the British. So to stop possible resistance, to stop their subjects from being able to revolt or rise up or defend themselves against a tyrannical government, the Spanish government in the New World kept Spanish armaments in central locations away from the people. The people's means of revolution and fighting against injustices was withheld from them. But so was their means of defense against the Apaches. Truly, thank God for our Second Amendment. In the next episode, the Apaches' rations cease when the cost becomes too high. But on top of that, there's the sale of Louisiana to the Americans. The invasion of Spain by Napoleon also happens, and then the Mexicans win their independence, which begins anew the battles in the region between the Apache and the people of Mexico. And then slowly, the White Eyes, the Americans, begin their manifest destiny. But you'll also hear how this Spanish policy of keeping the people unarmed backfires, like the defective guns the Spanish were giving the Apache. The Apache that never forgot how to use a bow and arrow. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.